The roar came first, a sound like thunder rolling down from the mountains, and Quinn Quad's head snapped up from where he was watering his horse at the creek, just as the wall of mud and debris came crashing down the hillside toward the woman in the blue calico dress, who stood frozen 20 yards away. He did not think, only moved, his boots pounding the earth as he ran faster than he had ever run in his life, and his arms closed around her slender frame just as the first wave of mud hit where she had been standing. They tumbled together down the embankment, rolling through brush and over rocks until they came to rest in a shallow gully, his body covering hers as the mudslide thundered past above them, filling the air with the smell of wet earth and pine. When the terrible noise finally subsided, and only the sound of his ragged breathing remained, he lifted his head and looked down at the woman beneath him, her green eyes wide with shock, and her dark hair escaped from its pins and spread across the ground like silk. "I've got you safe right now," he said, his voice rough, and something passed between them in that moment that felt like lightning striking the ground. Her name was Lorelei Ramsey, and she had come to Yosemite, California in the spring of 1883 to teach at the small schoolhouse that served the mining families and ranchers scattered throughout the valley. She was 22 years old, educated at a women's college in Boston, and completely unprepared for the wild beauty of the Sierra Nevada or for the tall cowboy with storm-gray eyes who had just saved her life. Quinn helped her to her feet, his hands steadying her at the elbows, and she noticed that his hands were calloused and strong, the hands of a man who worked hard for his living. He was perhaps 25 or 26, with sun-darkened skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, and when he looked at her with concern evident in every line of his face, her heart did something strange and unfamiliar in her chest. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his hands still on her arms, and she shook her head, unable to find words for a moment. The mudslide had carved a path of destruction through the forest above them, taking trees and boulders and everything in its path. If he had not reached her in time, she would have been swept away, buried under tons of earth and stone. The realization made her legs go weak, and he must have felt it because his grip tightened, holding her upright. "I'm all right," she managed to say, though her voice trembled. "Thank you. You saved my life." "The spring rains have been heavy this year," Quinn said, glancing up at the scar the mudslide had left on the hillside. "The ground gets unstable. You should not be out here alone." There was no reproach in his voice, only concern, and Lorelei felt her chin lift slightly. "I was collecting wildflowers for my students," she said, "to teach them about the native plants. I had no idea there was any danger." Quinn's expression softened, and he released her arms, though he stayed close, as if afraid she might still collapse. "You're the new schoolteacher," he said, and it was not a question. "I heard you had arrived from back east. I'm Quinn Quad. I have a ranch about 5 miles from here, up in the high country." "Lorelei Ramsey," she said, and offered her hand, which was filthy with mud. He took it anyway, his rough palm warm against hers, and held it perhaps a moment longer than was strictly proper. When he released it, she felt the loss of his touch like a physical thing. "I'll take you back to town," Quinn said. "My horse is just up the creek, if the mudslide did not spook him too badly." They found his horse, a big bay gelding, standing calmly where Quinn had left him, and he helped Lorelei into the saddle before swinging up behind her. She had never ridden like this before, seated in front of a man with his arms around her to hold the reins, and she was acutely aware of the solid warmth of his chest against her back, the strength in the arms that bracketed her. They rode in silence for a while, following the creek down toward the valley floor where the town of Yosemite lay nestled among the pines. The afternoon sun slanted through the trees, turning everything golden, and Lorelei found herself memorizing every detail of this moment, the way the horse's gait rocked them together, the smell of leather and pine, and something else that was uniquely Quinn. "How long have you been in California?" she asked finally, needing to break the silence before she became too lost in her own thoughts. "All my life," Quinn said. "I was born in Sacramento, but my father brought us here when I was a boy. He wanted to ranch in the mountains, said the high country was the most beautiful place on earth." He was right about that. "It is beautiful," Lorelei agreed. "I've never seen anything like it. In Boston, everything is buildings and cobblestones and crowds of people. Here, it feels like the world is still being made." She felt rather than saw his smile. "That's a good way to put it," he said. "Do you miss Boston?" "I miss my family," Lorelei admitted. "My mother and my 2 younger sisters. But I wanted adventure, wanted to see something beyond the narrow streets I grew up on, and I wanted to teach, to make a difference somehow." "Teaching is important work," Quinn said. "Especially out here, where schools are few and far between. The children are lucky to have you." They rode on, and Lorelei found herself relaxing against him, her initial embarrassment at their closeness fading into something warmer and more comfortable. By the time they reached the outskirts of town, she was almost disappointed that the ride had to end. Quinn helped her down from the horse in front of the boarding house where she rented a room, his hands strong and sure at her waist, and she looked up at him, suddenly shy. "Thank you again," she said. "I owe you my life, Mr. Quad." "Quinn," he said. "Please just call me Quinn, and you owe me nothing. I'm just glad I was there." "Still," Lorelei said, "I would like to repay your kindness somehow. Perhaps you would allow me to cook you dinner." "Tomorrow evening, if you're free." She saw surprise flicker across his face, followed by something that might have been pleasure. "I would like that very much," he said. "Thank you, Miss Ramsey." "Lorelei," she said, echoing his earlier request, and was rewarded with a genuine smile that transformed his serious face into something almost beautiful. "Lorelei," he repeated, as if testing the sound of her name on his tongue. "I'll come by around 6 if that suits you." "6 is perfect," she said, and stood watching as he swung back into the saddle and rode away, tall and straight-backed, until he disappeared around the corner. Only then did she realize that her heart was pounding and her hands were shaking, and she could not tell if it was delayed reaction from her near-death experience, or something else entirely. The next day passed in a blur of lessons and fidgeting students, and Lorelei found her mind wandering again and again to the evening ahead. She had arranged with Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house, to use the kitchen after the other boarders had eaten, and she spent the afternoon preparing a meal of roasted chicken, potatoes, green beans from the garden, and an apple pie that she hoped would not be a disaster. She was a competent cook, but she had never cooked for a man before, never entertained anyone in this way, and she was nervous in a way that made her feel like a girl again instead of a grown woman with a college education and a profession. Quinn arrived precisely at 6, wearing a clean shirt and with his dark hair still damp from washing, and he brought with him a bunch of wildflowers that made Lorelei's breath catch, because she realized he must have gone back to the site of the mudslide to gather them, risking danger to bring her something beautiful. She put them in a jar of water and set them on the small table in the boarding house dining room that Mrs. Henderson had allowed her to use, and then they sat down to eat. The conversation flowed easily, surprisingly so. Quinn told her about his ranch, about the cattle he raised and the horses he bred, about the challenges of making a living in the mountains where the winters were harsh and the growing season short. Lorelei talked about teaching, about her students who ranged in age from 6 to 15, and came from families scattered across miles of rough country. She told him about Boston, about her father who was a clerk in a shipping company and her mother who took in sewing to help make ends meet, about her decision to come west despite their worries and objections. "They thought I was being foolish," she said, serving him a second slice of pie. "My mother cried for a week before I left, but I had to do it, had to see if I could make my own way in the world." "That takes courage," Quinn said, looking at her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Not everyone has the strength to leave everything they know behind and start fresh." "You understand," Lorelei said, surprised and pleased. "Most people think I'm just a silly girl chasing romantic notions." "There's nothing silly about wanting more from life," Quinn said. "Nothing silly about being brave." Their eyes met across the table, and Lorelei felt that same jolt of connection she had felt when he pulled her from the path of the mudslide, as if something fundamental had shifted in the world and could never shift back. She looked away first, her cheeks warm, and began clearing the dishes to hide her confusion. Quinn helped her carry everything back to the kitchen, despite her protests, and they worked side by side, washing and drying in a companionable silence that felt as natural as breathing. When everything was clean and put away, they walked out onto the front porch of the boarding house, where the evening was settling in soft and purple over the mountains. Quinn stood with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly, and Lorelei could see that he was trying to find words for something. "I would like to see you again," he said finally, his voice low. "If you would allow it. I know I'm just a rancher and you're an educated woman from the city, but I have not been able to stop thinking about you since yesterday. Since the moment I looked down and saw your eyes looking back at me." Lorelei's heart was beating so hard she was certain he must hear it. "I would like that too," she said softly. "Very much. And you are not just anything, Quinn Quad. You are a good man who risked his own life to save mine. That means more to me than any amount of education or city polish." The smile that crossed his face was like sunrise, and he reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, and touched her cheek with his fingertips. "May I call on you Sunday?" he asked. "We could take a ride if the weather holds. I'd like to show you the high country where my ranch is." "I would love that," Lorelei said, and when he leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, she closed her eyes and felt herself falling into something vast and terrifying and wonderful. Quinn came by the schoolhouse on Sunday morning, riding the same bay gelding, and leading a pretty sorrel mare with a gentle eye and a sweet disposition. Lorelei had borrowed a riding habit from Mrs. Henderson's daughter, and though it was slightly too large and several years out of fashion, Quinn looked at her as if she were wearing silk and diamonds. They rode out of town together in the cool morning air, following trails that wound up into the mountains, through forests of towering pines and across meadows starred with wildflowers. Quinn pointed out landmarks and told her stories about the land, about the mining camps that had sprung up and died away, about the native people who had lived here for centuries before the white settlers came, about the bears and mountain lions that still roamed the high country. They stopped to rest beside a mountain lake so clear that Lorelei could see every pebble on the bottom, and Quinn unpacked the lunch he had brought, bread and cheese and cold chicken, and a canteen of sweet cider. They sat on a flat rock in the sunshine and ate, and Lorelei found herself telling him things she had never told anyone, about her fears and her hopes, about the loneliness she sometimes felt so far from home, about her determination to prove that she could make a life for herself out here in the wild country. "You're already proving it," Quinn said. "Every day that you stand in front of those children and teach them, you're proving it. And you're not alone, Lorelei, not anymore." She looked at him, at the earnestness in his gray eyes, and felt something break open inside her chest. something that had been locked away and protected for so long that she had almost forgotten it was there. "Quinn," she said, and then could not find any other words, so she reached out and took his hand instead. He laced his fingers through hers, his thumb stroking across her knuckles, and they sat like that for a long time, watching the sunlight dance on the surface of the lake. The weeks that followed fell into a pattern that felt like destiny unfolding. Quinn came to town every Sunday, and they spent the day together, riding through the mountains or walking along the creek, or simply sitting on the porch of the boarding house talking for hours. On Wednesday evenings, he would ride down from his ranch after finishing his work and have dinner with her, and those evenings became the center of Lorelei's week, the thing she looked forward to with an anticipation that was almost painful. She learned that Quinn's parents had both died when he was 20, his father from a fall from a horse and his mother from pneumonia the following winter, and that he had been running the ranch alone ever since, building it slowly into something successful and sustainable. She learned that he loved books, though he had little time to read, and that he had a quick, dry wit that could make her laugh until her sides ached. She learned that he was kind to animals and to people, that he was respected in the community for his fairness and his honesty, and that he had been lonely too, living by himself on his mountain ranch with only his horses and cattle for company. Summer came to the Sierra Nevada in a blaze of wildflowers and long golden evenings, and Lorelei found herself falling deeper and deeper in love with Quinn, though neither of them had spoken the words yet. It was there in every look, every touch, every moment they spent together, but the words remained unspoken, hanging between them like something precious and fragile that neither wanted to risk breaking. The school year ended, and Lorelei's students presented her with a bouquet of flowers and a handmade card thanking her for being their teacher, and she cried a little, moved by their sweetness. The summer stretched ahead, long and open, and Quinn asked if she would like to come up to his ranch for a week to see where he lived and how he worked. Mrs. Henderson agreed to act as chaperone, though Lorelei suspected the older woman knew perfectly well that she and Quinn were courting and approved wholeheartedly. The ranch was everything Quinn had described and more, a collection of sturdy buildings set in a high meadow with mountains rising on all sides like cathedral walls. There was the main house, built of logs and stone, with a wide porch and windows that looked out over the valley. There was a barn and corrals and outbuildings, all well maintained and neat. There were pastures where cattle grazed and horses ran, their coats shining in the summer sun. Quinn showed her everything with quiet pride, and Lorelei could see how much this place meant to him, how he had poured his heart and soul into building something lasting and good. Mrs. Henderson, bless her, made herself scarce during the days, claiming she needed to rest her old bones, and Lorelei spent the time following Quinn around as he did his work, learning about ranching and falling more in love with him with every passing hour. She loved watching him work with the horses, gentle and patient, his voice low and soothing. She loved the competent way he moved through his tasks, nothing wasted, everything done with care and attention. She loved the way he looked at her when he thought she was not watching, his eyes soft with an emotion that made her heart turn over in her chest. On the third evening of her visit, they walked up to a ridge above the ranch where the view stretched for miles in every direction, mountains and valleys and forests painted in shades of green and gold by the setting sun. Quinn spread a blanket on the grass, and they sat side by side, watching the light change and the shadows lengthen. Lorelei could feel the words building inside her, pressing against her ribs, demanding to be spoken, and finally she could hold them back no longer. "I love you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have loved you since the moment you pulled me from that mudslide and looked at me like I was something precious. I know it's probably too soon to say it, but I cannot keep pretending I don't feel it anymore." Quinn turned to her, his eyes wide with wonder, and took both her hands in his. "Lorelei," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "I love you too. I have loved you from that first moment, when I looked down and saw you looking back at me with mud in your hair and shock in your eyes, and I thought you were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I was afraid to say it, afraid you would think I was moving too fast or that you would not feel the same way." "I do feel the same way," Lorelei said, laughing and crying at the same time. "I love you so much it frightens me sometimes. I never knew I could feel this way about anyone." Quinn pulled her close, one hand coming up to cup her face, his thumb brushing away her tears. "Don't be frightened," he said softly. "I've got you safe right now. I will always keep you safe." And then he was kissing her, his lips warm and sure against hers, and Lorelei felt the world fall away until there was only this, only them, only the sweet, fierce joy of loving and being loved. When they finally drew apart, both breathing hard, the stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky above them, and Lorelei thought she had never seen anything more beautiful. "Marry me," Quinn said, still holding her face between his hands, his forehead resting against hers. "I know we have not known each other long, but I know my own heart, and I know I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Marry me, Lorelei. Be my wife. Come live with me here on this mountain and let me love you for all the days I have left." "Yes," Lorelei said, without hesitation, without doubt. "Yes, Quinn, I will marry you. I cannot imagine anything I want more." They were married in August, in the small church in Yosemite, with the whole town in attendance and wildflowers decorating every surface. Lorelei wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Henderson had helped her make, and Quinn wore a new suit that made him look both handsome and slightly uncomfortable. And when the minister pronounced them husband and wife and Quinn kissed her, the whole congregation burst into applause. They spent their wedding night in the ranch house that was now Lorelei's home, and she lay in Quinn's arms in the big bed he had built with his own hands and felt a completeness she had never imagined possible. This was where she was meant to be. This was home. The first year of their marriage was one of adjustment and discovery, of learning to live together and work together and navigate the challenges that came with making a life in the mountains. Lorelei had resigned her teaching position, though she continued to tutor some of the ranch children who lived too far from town to attend school regularly. She learned to cook on a wood stove and to preserve food for the winter, and to help with the ranch work when Quinn needed an extra pair of hands. It was hard work, harder than anything she had done in Boston or in the schoolhouse, but it was satisfying in a way that surprised her. She loved seeing the direct results of her labor, loved the physicality of it, loved working side by side with Quinn under the wide Sierra sky. Quinn, for his part, was endlessly patient with her mistakes and generous in his praise for her successes, and he made it clear in 1,000 small ways that he cherished her presence in his life. He would leave wildflowers on her pillow, or bring her coffee in bed on cold mornings, or read aloud to her in the evenings by the fire, his deep voice making poetry out of simple prose. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, and they laughed together until their sides ached, and they made love with a passion and tenderness that left Lorelei breathless with wonder at how lucky she was. Winter came early to the high country that year, with snow falling in October and not letting up until April. They were snowed in for weeks at a time, just the two of them and the livestock that needed tending no matter the weather. Quinn taught Lorelei to snowshoe so she could help him get to the barn and the animals, and they would trudge through drifts that came up to their waists. The world transformed into something stark and beautiful and alien. In the evenings, they would huddle close to the fire, wrapped in quilts, and Lorelei would read aloud from the books she had brought from Boston while Quinn whittled or mended harness by lamplight. It was a hard winter, but it was also wonderful in its way, a time of forced closeness that deepened their bond even more. Spring returned in a rush of snowmelt and birdsong, and with it came news that made Lorelei's hands shake and her eyes fill with tears of joy. She was pregnant. The doctor in town confirmed, and the baby would be born in late October if all went well. Quinn was beside himself with happiness when she told him, swinging her around in the kitchen despite her laughing protests, his face alight with a joy so pure it made her heart hurt. He became even more protective of her than before, insisting she rest more and lift less, hovering over her until she had to shoo him away so she could get her work done. But she loved it, loved being fussed over, loved the way he would rest his hand on her growing belly and talk to the baby as if it could already hear him. The pregnancy was not easy. Morning sickness plagued her through the first 4 months, and then her back began to ache constantly as the baby grew larger. The summer heat was oppressive, and she felt ungainly and huge, but Quinn never stopped telling her she was beautiful, never stopped looking at her with love and wonder. He built a cradle for the baby, working on it for weeks in the barn until it was perfect, smooth and strong and decorated with carvings of flowers and animals. Lorelei made tiny gowns and blankets, her needle flying as she imagined the small person who would soon wear them. They argued amiably over names, Quinn favoring traditional family names while Lorelei wanted something more unusual. And finally, they compromised, agreeing to wait until they saw the baby before deciding. The labor began on a clear October evening when the aspens on the mountainsides were turned to gold, and the air smelled of wood smoke and coming winter. It was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day, and there were moments when Lorelei was certain she could not endure another minute of pain. But Quinn was there, holding her hand and wiping her forehead and telling her she was strong, she could do this. He was there and he was not leaving. The doctor and Mrs. Henderson and another woman from town who had experience with childbirth were there too. But it was Quinn's presence that kept her grounded, that gave her the strength to push through the pain and the exhaustion. Finally, as the afternoon sun slanted through the bedroom window, the baby came into the world with a lusty cry that made everyone laugh with relief. It was a boy, perfect and healthy and more beautiful than Lorelei had imagined anything could be. The doctor placed him in her arms, and she looked down at the tiny red face and the shock of dark hair and felt her heart expand until she thought it might burst. Quinn leaned over them both, his eyes wet with tears, and touched one finger to the baby's tiny hand, which immediately closed around it in a grip that was surprisingly strong. "Hello, son," Quinn said, his voice breaking. "Welcome to the world." They named him Thomas, after Quinn's father, with the middle name of James for Lorelei's father, and he became the center of their universe. Those first weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and constant feeding and the steep learning curve of new parenthood. But even in her exhaustion, Lorelei had never been happier. Watching Quinn with their son, seeing the gentleness and patience and fierce protectiveness in every gesture, made her fall in love with him all over again. He would pace the floor with Thomas for hours when the baby was fussy, singing old cowboy songs in his rough voice, and Lorelei would watch from the bed and feel so full of love she could hardly breathe. The years that followed were full and rich, though not without their challenges. The ranch had good years and bad years. Times when the cattle prices were high and times when they struggled to make ends meet. There were harsh winters and dry summers, predators that took livestock and accidents that required trips to the doctor. When Thomas was 2, Lorelei became pregnant again, and this time the baby was a girl they named Emma Rose, with Lorelei's green eyes and Quinn's dark hair. 2 years after that came another boy, Daniel, who was quieter than his siblings and loved animals with a fierce devotion that reminded Lorelei of his father. The house that had seemed so spacious when it was just the two of them became crowded and noisy and full of life, and Lorelei would not have traded it for anything. She watched her children grow, watched them learn to ride and rope and work alongside their father, watched them play in the meadow and splash in the creek, and grow brown and strong under the Sierra sun. Quinn taught them everything he knew about ranching and about living on the land, but Lorelei made sure they learned to read and write and cipher as well, determined that they would have choices in their lives even if they chose to follow in their father's footsteps. The town of Yosemite grew and changed over the years. The railroad came through, bringing more settlers and more commerce. The mining camps mostly played out, but tourism began to grow as people from the cities discovered the beauty of the Sierra Nevada. Quinn and Lorelei watched these changes with mixed feelings, grateful for the prosperity they brought but wary of what would be lost. They made sure their children understood the importance of preserving the land, of treating it with respect and care, of remembering that they were stewards, not owners, of this wild and beautiful place. One evening in their 10th year of marriage, Lorelei stood on the porch of the ranch house watching the sun set over the mountains, and thinking about how much had changed since that day Quinn had pulled her from the path of the mudslide. She was 32 now, no longer the young schoolteacher from Boston but a rancher's wife, a mother of 3, a woman who could deliver a calf and shoot a rifle and ride all day without tiring. Her hands were rougher than they had been, her face more tanned, but when she looked in the mirror, she saw a woman who was happy, truly and deeply happy, in a way that her younger self had hardly dared to dream of. Quinn came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice warm against her ear. "About how lucky I am," Lorelei said, leaning back against him. "About how different my life is from what I thought it would be. About how grateful I am that it rained hard that spring and made the ground unstable, and you happened to be at the creek at exactly the right moment." "I think about that too," Quinn said. "About how easily I might have missed you, might never have known you existed. It terrifies me sometimes to think how close I came to losing you before I even found you." Lorelei turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to touch his face, which was lined now with years of sun and wind but still as dear to her as it had been that first day. "But you did not miss me," she said. "You saw the danger and you ran and you pulled me clear and you said you had me safe. And you have kept me safe ever since, not just from mudslides but from loneliness and fear and all the doubts I used to carry. You gave me a home and a family and a love I never knew existed. You gave me the same," Quinn said, his eyes bright with emotion. "You took this rough cowboy and made him into something better. You filled this house with love and laughter, and you gave me children who are the best thing I have ever had a hand in making. Every day with you is a gift, Lorelei. Every single day." They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms while the sun sank below the mountains, and the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. From inside the house came the sounds of their children getting ready for bed. Thomas's voice raised in some argument with Emma while Daniel sang tunelessly to himself. It was the soundtrack of their life, ordinary and precious and perfect, and Lorelei knew she would remember this moment always, this perfect contentment, this bone-deep knowledge that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The children grew, as children do, and the ranch prospered. Thomas showed an aptitude for working with the horses, and began breeding them with an eye toward selling them to the cavalry and to wealthy buyers from San Francisco. Emma proved to have a sharp head for business and began keeping the ranch accounts, her neat figures marching down the ledger pages with precision. Daniel, true to his early love of animals, became interested in veterinary medicine and announced his intention to study it when he was old enough. And Quinn and Lorelei encouraged him wholeheartedly, proud that their son wanted to help others, even if it meant leaving the ranch. There were grandchildren eventually, when Thomas married a girl from town and Emma found love with a young lawyer who had moved to Yosemite to set up practice. The house that Quinn had built grew to accommodate the expanding family, with new wings added and the porch extended so everyone could gather together on Sunday afternoons. Quinn's hair turned gray at the temples and then went white altogether, and Lorelei found silver threads in her own dark hair, but they wore their age with grace, grateful for every year they had been given together. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Quinn took Lorelei back to the ridge where he had proposed, where they had first confessed their love for each other under the wide Sierra sky. It was August again, high summer, and the meadows were carpeted with wildflowers just as they had been all those years ago. They climbed the trail slowly, not as spry as they once were, and when they reached the top, Quinn spread a blanket on the grass just as he had done that first time. "Do you remember?" he asked, taking her hand as they sat down side by side. "Every detail," Lorelei said. "How terrified I was to say the words, how certain I was that you would think I was being foolish, how you looked at me like I had given you the world." "You did give me the world," Quinn said. "You are my world, Lorelei, you and the children and the life we have built together. 25 years, and I love you more now than I did then. I did not think that was possible, but it is." Lorelei felt tears prick her eyes, the good kind of tears, the kind that came from joy too large to be contained. "I love you too," she said. "My cowboy, my hero, the man who saved my life in more ways than one." They sat together as the sun set, just as they had done so many times before, watching the light change and the shadows lengthen and the stars begin to emerge. Below them, the ranch spread out in the valley, the buildings they had maintained and the fences they had mended and the land they had cared for. Smoke rose from the chimney of the main house, where their children and grandchildren were preparing a celebration dinner. In a little while they would go back down and join them, and there would be food and laughter and music and all the noise and warmth of family. But for now, it was just the two of them, alone on their mountain, surrounded by the wild beauty of the place that had brought them together. "Thank you," Lorelei said softly, "for seeing the mudslide coming, for pulling me clear, for telling me you had me safe." Quinn turned to her, his weathered face soft with love, and pulled her close. "I've got you safe right now," he said, echoing the words he had spoken so long ago, "and I always will. For as long as I live and beyond, if such things are possible, you are safe with me, Lorelei. You always have been. You always will be." And sitting there on their mountain, wrapped in her husband's arms with a lifetime of love behind them and whatever years remained ahead, Lorelei knew it was true. She was safe, she was loved, and she was home. The mudslide that had nearly taken her life had instead given it to her, had brought her to this man, and this place, and this beautiful, imperfect, joy-filled existence. She had come to California seeking adventure and purpose, a naive girl from Boston who thought she knew what she wanted. What she had found instead was was so much more than she had imagined. A love story written in the wild country, a partnership forged through hard work and shared dreams, a family that would carry on long after she and Quinn were gone. The years continued to pass, as they always do, and Quinn and Lorelei grew older together, their bodies slowing but their love remaining constant. They saw Daniel graduate from veterinary school and return to Yosemite to open a practice, serving the ranchers and farmers throughout the region. They saw Thomas expand the horse breeding operation until quad horses were sought after throughout California. They saw Emma become a pillar of the community, involved in everything from the school board to the preservation society that worked to protect the natural beauty of the Sierra Nevada. The grandchildren came in a steady stream, filling the house with noise and energy, and keeping Quinn and Lorelei young in spirit even as their bodies aged. They taught the grandchildren the same things they had taught their own children: how to respect the land and work hard and treat others with kindness and honesty. They told them stories about the old days, about the mudslide that had brought their grandparents together, about the early years on the ranch when everything was a struggle, but nothing could dim their determination or their love. On a clear spring morning in their 40th year of marriage, Lorelei woke to find Quinn already up and dressed, standing at the window looking out at the mountains. She joined him there, slipping her hand into his, and they stood together watching the sunrise paint the peaks in shades of rose and gold. "I was thinking," Quinn said, "about that day at the creek, about how everything changed in an instant. One moment you were standing there collecting flowers, and the next our whole lives were set in motion. Fate," Lorelei said, "or destiny, or just extraordinary luck. Whatever it was, I am grateful for it every day." "As am I," Quinn said, raising her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. "As am I." They lived to see their 50th wedding anniversary, a milestone celebrated with a party that brought family and friends from all over California. The house was bursting with people. 3 generations gathered to honor the love that had started it all, and Lorelei looked around at the faces of her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and felt a pride and contentment that went beyond words. She and Quinn stood together in the center of the room while their family toasted them, and when Quinn was asked to say a few words, he kept it simple. "50 years ago," he said, his voice still strong despite his age, "I was watering my horse at a creek when I heard a sound like thunder. I looked up and saw a wall of mud coming down the mountain toward a woman in a blue dress. I ran faster than I have ever run before or since, and I pulled her clear just in time. I told her I had her safe. What I did not know then was that in saving her, she would save me too. She has been my partner, my love, my reason for everything for 50 years, and if I am granted another 50, I will spend every day thanking God that I was in the right place at the right time to see the danger and act. To Lorelei, the love of my life." "To Lorelei," everyone echoed, raising their glasses, and Lorelei laughed and cried and kissed her husband while their family cheered and applauded around them. Quinn passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 years later, at the age of 81, with Lorelei holding his hand. His death was not unexpected. His health had been failing for months, but it still felt like the sun going out, like the world losing its center. Lorelei mourned him with a grief that was profound but not bitter, because she knew how lucky she had been to have him for so many years, to have built such a life together. They buried him on the ridge where he had proposed, where they had spent so many evenings watching the sun set together, and Lorelei made sure the headstone was simple and strong, just like the man it marked. She lived another 7 years after Quinn's death, and though she missed him every day, she was never truly alone. Her children and grandchildren surrounded her with love and care, making sure she wanted for nothing, visiting constantly to check on her and share their lives with her. She spent her days reading and tending her garden and playing with the great-grandchildren who thought their tiny, white-haired great-grandmother was magical. She told them stories about their great-grandfather, about the cowboy who had saved her from the mudslide and captured her heart, and she made sure they understood the legacy he had left them, not just the ranch and the land, but the values of hard work and integrity and love that had guided his life. On a warm afternoon in late summer, Lorelei sat on the porch of the ranch house looking out at the mountains she had loved for so long. She was tired, bone-tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with a life fully lived. She thought about Quinn, about how he had looked that day at the creek with mud on his clothes and concern in his eyes, about how he had held her and told her she was safe. She thought about their wedding day, about the births of their children, about 1,000 ordinary moments that had added up to an extraordinary life. She thought about the mudslide that had set everything in motion, about how close she had come to dying that day, and how instead she had found the truest, deepest love she could have imagined. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple, Lorelei closed her eyes and let herself relax completely, let herself drift. And in her mind, she saw Quinn standing in the golden light, young and strong again, reaching out his hand to her with that smile she loved so much. She heard his voice, clear as a bell, saying the words he had said so long ago. "I have got you safe right now." Lorelei smiled and took his hand, and together they walked into the light, into whatever came next, together as they had always been, safe in the knowledge that their love had created something lasting and good that would continue long after they were gone. The ranch would endure, cared for by the family they had raised. The story of the mudslide and the cowboy and the schoolteacher from Boston would be passed down through generations, a reminder that love can come in an instant and last a lifetime, that courage and kindness matter, that the choices we make in moments of crisis can change everything. And high on the ridge where Quinn was buried, where they had confessed their love and celebrated their anniversary and spent so many evenings together, the wildflowers bloomed year after year, a living testament to a love story that had begun with a mudslide and ended only when both hearts had finally stilled, full and satisfied and grateful for every moment they had been given together in the wild, beautiful Sierra Nevada.